Hello friends, I welcome you to this safe space and tonight's edition of Sleep Story. This evening I shall be reading for you stories written by Lucy Maud Montgomery. It is time to unwind. Find yourself a place where you can safely relax. Once you settle into that place, close your eyes and take a deep breath. Your day has come to an end. All that is left to do now is to fall asleep while you listen to these stories. Natty of Blue Point. Natty Miller strolled down to the wharf where Bliss Ford was tying up their cockery. Bliss was scowling darkly at the boat, a trim new one, painted white, whose furled sails seemed unaccountably wet and whose glistening interior likewise dripped with moisture. A group of fishermen on the wharf were shaking their heads sagely as Natty drew near. "Might as well split her up for kindlings, Bliss," said Jake McLaren. "You'll never get men to sail in her." It passed the first time, seeing as only young Johnson was skipper. But when a boat turns turtle, with Captain Frank in command, there's something serious wrong with her. "What's up?" asked Natty. "The cockery upset out in the bay again this morning," answered Will Scott. "That's the second time. The Grey Gull picked up the man and towed her in. It's no use trying to sail her. Lobstermen ain't going to risk their lives in a boat like that. How's things over at Blue Point, Natty?" "Pretty well," responded Natty laconically. Natty never wasted words. He had not talked a great deal in his 14 years of life, but he was much given to thinking. He was rather undersized and insignificant looking, but there were a few boys of his own age on the mainland who knew that Natty had muscles. "Has Everett heard anything from Ottawa about the lighthouse business yet?" asked Will. Natty shook his head. "Think he's any chance of getting the appointment?" queried Adam Lewis. "Not the ghost of a chance," said Cooper Creasy decidedly. "Mr. Barr says that Everett is too young to be trusted in such a responsible position," quoted Natty gravely. Cooper shrugged his shoulders. Maybe. 18 is kind of green, but everybody knows that Ev's been the real lighthouse keeper for 2 years, since your father too sick. Irving Elliott wants that light, has wanted it for years, and he's a pretty strong pull at headquarters, that's what. I ain't saying anything against Elliott either. He's a good man, but your father's son ought to have the light as sure as he won't get it, that's what. Any of you going to take in the sports tomorrow down at Summerside?" asked Will Scott. "I'm going for one," said Adam. "There's to be a yacht race between the Summerside and Charlottetown boat clubs." "Yes, I'm going. Give you a chance down to the station, Natty, if you want one." Natty shook his head. "Not going," he said briefly. "You should celebrate Victoria Day," said Adam patriotically. 24th of May, the Queen's birthday. If we don't get a holiday, we'll all run away, as we used to say at school. The good old Queen is dead, but the day's been appointed a national holiday in honor of her memory, and you should celebrate it becoming, Natty boy. Ev and I can't both go, and he's going," explained Natty. Prue and I'll stay home to light up. Must be getting back now. Looks squally. I misdoubt if we'll have Queen's weather tomorrow, said Cooper, squinting critically at the sky. Looks like a northeast blow, that's what. There goes Bliss, striding off and looking pretty mad. The cockery's a dead loss to him, that's what. Nat's off. He knows how to handle a boat middling well, too. Pity he's such a puny youngster. Not much to him, I reckon. Natty had cast loose in his boat, the Merry Mate, and hoisted his sail. In a few minutes he was skimming gaily down the bay. The wind was fair and piping, and the Merry Mate went like a bird. Natty, at the rudder, steered for Blue Point Island, a reflective frown on his face. He was feeling in no mood for Victoria Day sports. In a very short time, he and Ev and Prue must leave Blue Point Lighthouse, where they had lived all their lives. To Natty it seemed as if the end of all things would come then. Where would life be worth living away from lonely, windy Blue Point Island? David Miller had died the preceding winter after a long illness. He had been lighthouse keeper at Blue Point for 30 years. His 3 children had been born and brought up there. And there, 4 years ago, the mother had died. But womanly little Prue had taken her place well, and the boys were devoted to their sister. When the father died, Everett had applied for the position of lighthouse keeper. The matter was not yet publicly decided, but old Cooper Creasy had sized the situation up accurately. The Millers had no real hope that Everett would be appointed. Victoria Day, while not absolutely stormy, proved to be rather unpleasant. A choppy northeast wind blew up the bay, and the water was rough enough. The sky was overcast with clouds, and the May air was raw and chilly. At Blue Point the Millers were early astir, for if Everett wanted to sail over to the mainland in time to catch the excursion train, no morning naps were permissible. He was going alone, since only one of the boys could go. Natty had insisted that it should be Everett, and Prue had elected to stay home with Natty. Prue had small heart for Victoria Day that year. She did not feel even a thrill of enthusiasm when Natty hoisted the flag and wreathed the Queen's picture with creeping spruce. Prue felt as badly about leaving Blue Point Island as the boys did. The day passed slowly. In the afternoon the wind fell away to a dead calm, but there was still a heavy swell on. And shortly before sunset a fog came creeping up from the east and spread over the bay and islands, so thick and white that Prue and Natty could not even see Little Bear Island on the right. "I'm glad Everett isn't coming back tonight," said Prue. "He could never find his way across the harbor in that fog." "Isn't it thick, though?" said Natty. "The light won't show far tonight." At sunset they lighted the great lamps and then settled down to an evening of reading. But it was not long before Natty looked up from his book to say, "Hello, Prue, what was that? Thought I heard a noise." "So did I," said Prue. "It sounded like someone calling." They hurried to the door, which looked out on the harbor. The night, owing to the fog, was dark with a darkness that seemed almost tangible. From somewhere out of the darkness came a muffled shouting, like that of a person in distress. "Prue, there's somebody in trouble out there," exclaimed Natty. "Oh, it surely never have," cried Prue. Natty shook his head. Don't think so. Ev had no intention of coming back tonight. Get that lantern, Prue. I must go and see what and who it is. Oh, Natty, you mustn't, cried Prue in distress. There's a heavy swell on yet, and the fog. Oh, if you get lost. I'll not get lost, and I must go, Prue. Maybe somebody is drowning out there. It's not Ev, of course, but suppose it were. Prue, with set face, had brought the lantern, resolutely choking back the words of fear and protest that rushed to her lips. They hurried down to the shore, and Natty sprang into the little skiff he used for rowing. He hastily lashed the lantern in the stern, cast loose the painter, and lifted the oars. I'll be back as soon as possible, he called to Prue. Wait here for me. In a minute the shore was out of sight, and Natty found himself alone in the black fog, with no guide but the cries for help, which already were becoming fainter. They seemed to come from the direction of Little Bear, and thither Natty rowed. It was a tough pull, and the water was rough enough for a little dory, but Natty had been at home with the oars from babyhood, and his long training and tough sinews stood him in good stead now. Steadily and intrepidly he rowed along. The water grew rougher as he passed out from the shelter of Blue Point into the channel between the latter and Little Bear. The cries were becoming very faint. What if he should be too late? He bent to the oars with all his energy. Presently, by the smoother water, he knew he must be in the lee of Little Bear. The cries sounded nearer. He must already have rowed nearly a mile. The next minute he shot around a small headland, and right before him, dimly visible in the faint light cast by the lantern through the fog, was an upturned boat with 2 men clinging to it, one on each side, evidently almost exhausted. Natty rowed cautiously up to the one nearest him, knowing that he must be wary lest the grip of the drowning man overturns his own light skiff. "Let go when I say," he shouted, "and don't grab anything, do you hear? Don't grab. Now, let go." The next minute the man lay in the dory, dragged over the stern by Natty's grip on his collar. "Lie still," ordered Natty, clutching the oars, to row around the overturned boat. Amid the swirl of water about her was a task that taxed Natty's skill and strength to the utmost. The other man was dragged in over the bow, and with a gasp of relief, Natty pulled away from the sinking boat. Once clear of her, he could not row for a few minutes. He was shaking from head to foot, with the reaction from tremendous effort and strain. "This'll never do," he muttered. "I'm not going to be a baby now, but will I ever be able to row back?" Presently, however, he was able to grip his oars again and pull for the lighthouse, whose beacon loomed dimly through the fog, like a great blur of whiter mist. The man, obedient to his orders, lay quietly where he had placed them, and before long Natty was back again at the lighthouse landing, where Prue was waiting, wild with anxiety. The men were helped out and assisted up to the lighthouse, where Natty went to hunt up dry clothes for them, and Prue flew about to prepare hot drinks. "To think that that child saved us," exclaimed one of the men. "Why, I didn't think a grown man had the strength to do what he did. He is your brother, I suppose, Miss Miller? You have another brother, I think." Oh, yes, Everett, but he is away, explained Prue. We heard your shouts, and Natty insisted on going at once to your rescue. Well, he came just in time. I couldn't have held on another minute. Was so done up I couldn't have moved or spoken all the way here, even if he hadn't commanded me to keep perfectly still. Natty returned at this moment and exclaimed, Why, it is Mr. Barr. I didn't recognize you before. Barr it is, young man. This gentleman is my friend, Mr. Blackmore. We have been celebrating Victoria Day by a shooting tramp over Little Bear. We hired a boat from Ford at the harbor head this morning, the Cockawee, he called her, and sailed over. I don't know much about running a boat, but Blackmore here thinks he does. We were at the other side of the island when the fog came up. We hurried across it, but it was almost dark when we reached our boat. We sailed around the point, and then the boat just simply upset. Don't know why. But I know why, interrupted Natty indignantly. That Cockawee does nothing but upset. She has turned turtle twice out in the harbor in fine weather. Ford was a rascal to let her to you. He might have known what would happen. Why, it was almost murder to let you go. I thought there must be something queer about her, declared Mr. Blackmore. I do know how to handle a boat despite my friend's jibe, and there was no reason why she should have upset like that. That Ford ought to be horsewhipped. Thanks to Prue's stinging hot decoctions of blackcurrant drink, the two gentlemen were no worse for the drenching and exposure, and the next morning Natty took them to the mainland in the Merry Maid. When he parted with them, Mr. Barr shook his hand heartily and said, Thank you, my boy. You're a plucky youngster and a skillful one, too. Tell your brother that if I can get the Blue Point Lighthouse berth for him, I will. And as for yourself, you will always find a friend in me. And if I can ever do anything for you, I will. 2 weeks later, Everett received an official document formally appointing him Keeper of Blue Point Island Light. Natty carried the news to the mainland, where it was joyfully received among the fishermen. Only right and fair, said Cooper Creasy. Blue Point without a miller to light up wouldn't seem the thing at all, that's what. And it's nothing but Ev's due. Guess Natty had more to do with it than Ev, said Adam, perpetrating a very poor pun and being immensely applauded therefor. I keyed Will Scott up to rival Adam. You said that Irving had a pull and the Millers hadn't, he said jocularly. But it looks as if 'twas Natty's pull did the business after all. His pull over to Bear Island and back. It was about a miracle that a boy could do what he did on such a night, said Charles Macy. Where's Ford? Asked Natty uncomfortably. He hated to have his exploit talked about. Ford has cleared out, said Cooper. Gone down to Summerside to go into Tobe Meakin's factory. Best thing he could do, that's what. Folks here hadn't no use for him after letting that death trap to them two men. The Cockawee drove ashore on Little Bear, and there she's going to remain, I guess. Do you want a berth in my mackerel boat this summer, Natty? I do, said Natty, but I thought you said you were full. I guess I can make room for you, said Cooper. A boy with such grit and muscle ain't to be allowed to go to seed on Blue Point, that's what. Yes, sir, we'll make room for you. And Natty's cup of happiness was full. Mrs. March's Revenge. I declare, it is a real fall day, said Mrs. Stapp, dropping into a chair with a sigh of relief, as Mrs. March ushered her into the cozy little sitting room. The wind would chill the marrow in your bones. Winter'll be here before you know it. That's so, assented Mrs. March, bustling about to stir up the fire. But I don't know as I mind it at all. Winter is real pleasant when it does come, but I must say, I don't fancy these betwixt and between days much. Sit up to the fire, Theodosia. You look real blue. I feel so too, lawful heart. But this is comfort. This chimney corner of yours, Anna, is the coziest spot in the world. When did you get home from Maitland? Asked Mrs. March. Did you have a pleasant time? And how did you leave Emily and the children? Mrs. Stapp took this trio of interrogations in calm detail. I came home Saturday, she said, as she unrolled her knitting. Nice wet day it was, too. And as for my visit, yes, I enjoyed myself pretty well, not but what I worried over Peter's rheumatism a good deal. Emily is well, and the children ought to be, for such rampageous young ones I never saw. Emily can't do no more with them than an old hen with a brood of ducks. But, lawful heart, Anna, don't mind about my little affairs. These news Peter had for me about you when I got home fairly took my breath. He came down to the garden gate to shout it before I was out of the wagon. I couldn't believe but what he was joking at first. You should have seen Peter. He had an old red shawl tied round his rheumatic shoulder, and he was waving his arms like a crazy man. I declare, I thought the chimney was afire. Theodosia, Theodosia, he shouted. Anna March has had a fortune left her by her brother in Australia, and she bought the old Carroll place and is going to move up there. That was his salute when I got home. I'd have been over before this to hear all about it, but things were at such sixes and sevens in the house that I couldn't go visiting until I'd straightened them out a bit. Peter's real neat, as men go, but lawful heart, such a mess as he makes of housekeeping. I didn't know you had a brother living. No more did I, Theodosia. I thought, as everyone else did, that poor Charles was at the bottom of the sea 40 years ago. It's that long since he ran away from home. He had a quarrel with father, and he was always dreadful high-spirited. He went to sea, and we heard that he had sailed for England in the Helen Ray. She was never heard of after, and we all supposed that my poor brother had perished with her. And 4 weeks ago I got a letter from a firm of lawyers in Melbourne, Australia, saying that my brother, Charles Bennet, had died and left all his fortune to me. I couldn't believe it at first, but they sent me some things of his that he had when he left home, and there was an old picture of myself among them with my name written on it in my own hand. So then I knew there was no mistake. But whether Charles did sail in the Helen Ray, or if he did, how he escaped from her and got to Australia, I don't know, and it isn't likely I ever will. Well, of all wonderful things, commented Mrs. Stapp. I was glad to hear that I was heir to so much money, said Mrs. March firmly. At first I felt as if it were awful of me to be glad when it came to me by my brother's death. But I mourned for poor Charles 40 years ago, and I can't sense that he has only just died. Not but what I'd rather have seen him come home alive than have all the money in the world. But it has come about otherwise, and as the money is lawfully mine, I may as well feel pleased about it. And you've bought the Carroll place, said Mrs. Stapp with the freedom of a privileged friend. "Whatever made you do it? I'm sure you are as cozy here as need be, and nobody but yourself. Isn't this house big enough for you?" "No, it isn't. All my life I've been hankering for a good, big, roomy house. And all my life I've had to put up with little boxes of places, not big enough to turn round in. I've been contented, and made the best of what I had. But now that I can afford it, I mean to have a house that will suit me. The Carroll house is just what I want. For all, it is a little old-fashioned. I've always had a notion of that house, although I never expected to own it any more than the moon." "It's a real handsome place," admitted Mrs. Stapp, "but I expect it will need a lot of fixing up. Nobody has lived in it for 6 years. When are you going to move in?" "In about 3 weeks, if all goes well. I'm having it all painted and done over inside. The outside can wait until the spring." "It's queer how things come about," said Mrs. Stapp meditatively. "I guess old Mrs. Carroll never imagined her home was going to pass into other folks' hands as it has. When you and I were girls, and Louise Carroll was giving herself such airs over us, you didn't much expect to ever stand in her shoes, did you? Do you remember, Lou?" "Yes, I do," said Mrs. March sharply. A change came over her sonsy, smiling face. It actually looked hard and revengeful, and a cruel light flickered in her dark brown eyes. "I'll not forget Lou Carroll as long as I live. She is the only person in the world I ever hated. I suppose it is sinful to say it, but I hate her still, and always will." "I never liked her myself," admitted Mrs. Stapp. "She thought herself above us all. Well, for that matter, I suppose she was, but she needn't have rubbed it in so." "Well, she might have been above me," said Mrs. March bitterly. "But she wasn't above twitting and snubbing me every chance she got. She always had a spite at me from the time we were children together at school. When we grew up, it was worse. I couldn't begin to tell you all the times that girl insulted me. But there was once in particular. I'll never forgive her for it. I was at a party, and she was there too, and so was that young Trenham Manning, who was visiting the Ashleys. Do you remember him, Doja? He was a handsome young fellow, and Lou had a liking for him. So all the girls said. But he never looked at her that night, and he kept by me the whole time. It made Lou furious, and at last she came up to me, with a sneer on her face, and her black eyes just snapping, and said, 'Miss Bennet, Mother told me to tell your ma, that if that plain sewing isn't done by tomorrow night, she'll send for it and give it to somebody else. If people engage to have work done by a certain time and don't keep their word, they needn't expect to get it.' Oh, how badly I felt. Mother and I were poor and had to work hard, but we had feelings just like other people. And to be insulted like that before Trenham Manning. I just burst out crying then and there, and ran away and hid. It was very silly of me, but I couldn't help it. That stings me yet. If I were ever to get the chance to pay Lou Carroll out for that, I'd take it without any compunction." "Oh, but that is unchristian," protested Mrs. Stapp feebly. "Perhaps so, but it's the way I feel. Old Parson Jones used to say that people were marbled, good and bad, pretty even, but that in everybody there were 1 or 2 streaks, just pure wicked. I guess Lou Carroll is my wicked streak. I haven't seen or heard of her for years. Ever since she married that worthless Dancy Baxter and went away. She may be dead for all I know. I don't expect ever to have a chance to pay her out. But mark what I say, Theodosia. If I ever have, I will." Mrs. March snipped off her threat, as if she challenged the world. Mrs. Stapp felt uncomfortable over the unusual display of feeling she had evoked, and hastened to change the subject. In 3 weeks' time, Mrs. March was established in her new home, and the old Carroll house blossomed out into renewed splendor. Theodosia Stapp, who had dropped in to see it, was in a rapture of admiration. "You have a lovely home now, Anna. I used to think it fine enough in the Carrolls' time, but it wasn't as grand as this. And that reminds me, I have something to tell you, but I don't want to get as excited as you did the last time I mentioned her name. You remember, the last day I was to see you, we were talking of Lou Carroll. Well, next day I was downtown in a store, and who should sail in but Mrs. Joel Kent, from Oriental. You know Mrs. Joel, Sarah Chapel, that was. She and her man keep a little hotel up at Oriental. They're not very well off. She's a cousin of old Mrs. Carroll, but lawful heart. The Carrolls didn't used to make much of their relationship. Well, Mrs. Joel and I had a chat. She told me all her troubles. She always has lots of them. Sarah was always of a grumbling turn, and she had a brand new stock of them this time. What do you think, Anna March? Lou Carroll, or Mrs. Baxter, I suppose I should say, is up there at Joel Kent's at Oriental, dying of consumption. Leastwise, Mrs. Joel says she is." "Lou Carroll, dying at Oriental," cried Mrs. March. "Yes, she came there from goodness knows where, about a month ago. Might as well have dropped from the clouds, Mrs. Joel says, for all she expected of it. Her husband is dead, and I guess he led her a life of it when he was alive, and she's as poor as second skimmings. She was aiming to come here, Mrs. Joel says, but when she got to Oriental, she wasn't fit to stir a step further, and the Kents had to keep her. I gather from what Mrs. Joel said that she's rather touched in her mind too, and has an awful hankering to get home here, to this very house. She appears to have the idea that it is hers, and all just the same as it used to be. I guess she is a sight of trouble, and Mrs. Joel ain't the woman to like that. But there, she has to work most awful hard, and I suppose a sick person doesn't come handy in a hotel. I guess you've got your revenge, Anna, without lifting a finger to get it. Think of Lou Carroll coming to that." The next day was cold and raw. The ragged, bare trees in the old Carroll grounds shook and writhed in the gusts of wind. Now and then a drifting scud of rain dashed across the windows. Mrs. March looked out with a shiver, and turned thankfully to her own cozy fireplace again. Presently she thought she heard a low knock at the front door, and went to see. As she opened it, a savage swirl of damp wind rushed in, and the shrieking figure, leaning against one of the fluted columns of the Grecian porch, seemed to cower before its fury. It was a woman who stood there, a woman whose emancipated face wore a piteous expression as she lifted it to Mrs. March. "You don't know me, of course," she said, with a feeble attempt at dignity. "I am Mrs. Baxter. I used to live here long ago. I thought I'd walk over today and see my old home." A fit of coughing interrupted her words, and she trembled like a leaf. "Gracious me!" exclaimed Mrs. March blankly. "You don't mean to tell me that you have walked over from Oriental today?" And you, a sick woman. For pity's sake, come in, quick, and if you're not wet to the skin." She fairly pulled her visitor into the hall and led her to the sitting room. "Sit down. Take this big easy chair right up to the fire. So, let me take your bonnet and shawl. I must run right out to tell Hannah to get you a hot drink." "You are very kind," whispered the other. "I don't know you, but you look like a woman I used to know when I was a girl. She was a Mrs. Bennet, and she had a daughter, Anna. Do you know what became of her? I forget everything now." "My name is March," said Mrs. March briefly, ignoring the question. "I don't suppose you ever heard it before." She wrapped her own warm shawl about the other woman's thin shoulders. Then she hastened to the kitchen, and soon returned, carrying a tray of food and a steaming hot drink. She wheeled a small table up to her visitor's side and said very kindly, "Now, take a bite, my dear, and this raspberry vinegar will warm you right up. It is a dreadful day for you to be out. Why on earth didn't Joe Kent drive you over?" "They didn't know I was coming," whispered Mrs. Baxter anxiously. I ran away. Sarah wouldn't have let me come if she had known. But I wanted to come so much. It is so nice to be home again." Mrs. March watched her guest as she ate and drank. It was plain enough that her mind, or rather her memory, was affected. She did not realize that this was no longer her home. At moments she seemed to fancy herself back in the past again. Once or twice she called Mrs. March Mother. Presently a sharp knock was heard at the hall door. Mrs. March excused herself and went out. In the porch stood Theodosia Stapp, and a woman whom Mrs. March did not at first glance recognize. A tall, aggressive-looking person, whose sharp black eyes darted in past Mrs. March and searched every corner of the hall before anyone had time to speak. "A lawful heart," puffed Mrs. Stapp as she stepped in out of the biting wind. "I'm right out of breath, Mrs. March. Allow me to introduce Mrs. Kent. We're looking for Mrs. Baxter. She has run away, and we thought perhaps she came here. Did she?" "She is in my sitting room now," said Mrs. March quietly. "Didn't I say so?" demanded Mrs. Kent, turning to Mrs. Stapp. She spoke in a sharp, high-pitched tone that grated on Mrs. March's nerves. "Doesn't she beat all? She slipped away this morning when I was busy in the kitchen. And to think of her walking 6 miles over here, in this wind. I don't know how she did it. I don't believe she's half as sick as she pretends. Well, I've got my wagon out here, Mrs. March, and I'll be much obliged if you tell her I'm here to take her home. I suppose we'll have a fearful scene." "I don't see that there is any call for a scene," said Mrs. March firmly. "The poor woman has just got here, and she thinks she has got home. She might as well think so, if it is of any comfort to her. You'd better leave her here." Theodosia gave a stifled gasp of amazement, but Mrs. March went serenely on. "I'll take care of the poor soul as long as she needs it, and that will not be very long in my opinion. For if ever I saw death in a woman's face, it is looking out of hers. I've plenty of time to look after her and make her comfortable." Mrs. Joel Kent was voluble in her thanks. It was evident that she was delighted to get the sick woman off her hands. Mrs. March cut her short with an invitation to stay to tea, but Mrs. Kent declined. I've got to hurry home straight off and get the men's supper. Such a scamper to have over that woman. I'm sure I'm thankful you're willing to let her stay, for she'd never be contented anywhere else. I'll send over what few things she has tomorrow." When Mrs. Kent had gone, Mrs. March and Mrs. Stapp looked at each other. "And so this is your revenge, Anna March," said the latter solemnly. "Do you remember what you said to me about her?" "Yes, I do, Theodosia, and I thought I meant every word of it. But I guess my wicked streak ran out just when I needed it to depend on. Besides, you see, I've thought of Lou Carroll all these years, as she was when I knew her. Handsome and saucy and proud. But that poor creature in there isn't any more like the Lou Carroll I knew than you are, not a mite. The old Lou Carroll is dead already, and my spite is dead with her. Will you come in and see her?" "Well, no, not just now. She wouldn't know me, and Mrs. Joel says strangers kind of excite her. A pretty bad place the hotel would be for her at that rate, I should think. I must go and tell Peter about it, and I'll send up some of my black currant jam for her." When Mrs. Stapp had gone, Mrs. March went back to her guest. Lou Baxter had fallen asleep, with her head pillowed on the soft plush back of her chair. Mrs. March looked at the hollow, hectic cheeks of the changed, wasted features, and her bright brown eyes softened with tears. "Poor Lou," she said softly, as she brushed a loose lock of grey hair back from the sleeping woman's brow.